The summer Marcus Hale turned 14, he did something that made the entire town of Gravel Creek, Tennessee stop, stare, and laugh. He started digging a hole, not a small one, not a garden trench or a fishing pit, a pond, a full, sprawling pond carved into the corner of his grandfather's best farmland, the kind of land that could have grown soybeans, corn, maybe alfalfa, the kind of land families in that part of Tennessee had worked for generations without wasting a single square foot. Old Ray Cutter leaned against his fence post on a Tuesday morning, watching the boy hack at the red clay earth with a borrowed excavating machine. Barely knew how to operate and shook his head so slowly it seemed like it might never stop. "That boy has lost his mind," he said to no one in particular. "Absolutely lost it." Down at the feed store, the laughter came easy. People in Gravel Creek didn't mince words when they thought something was foolish, and a skinny, quiet 14-year-old tearing up prime agricultural land to fill it with rainwater was about as foolish as it got. His grandpa let him do that? Seems like it. That's a shame. Nice piece of ground. Two farmers stopped their trucks on the county road one afternoon just to get a better look, then drove off shaking their heads. A woman who lived 3 lots over called it a crying waste. A man who'd farmed his whole life declared it proof that kids today don't understand what land is for. Nobody took Marcus seriously. Not the adults, not the old-timers, not the people who'd spent their lives reading the seasons, working the soil, and believing they understood exactly how this valley worked. They were wrong. They didn't know it yet, but within a year, every well in the valley would begin to fail. Marcus Hale was not the kind of boy who demanded attention. He was quiet in the way that some kids are not shy exactly, not broken or sad, but inward thoughtful. The kind of quiet that made adults uncomfortable because it was hard to read. He didn't play sports. He wasn't loud at school. He didn't crack jokes at the lunch table or dominate conversations at family dinners. He sat and he listened, and he watched. He watched everything. He watched the way the creek behind his grandfather's property slowed to a crawl each summer, then barely trickled by August. He watched the places where the moss dried out first, and the places where it stayed green longer than it should have. He watched which patches of field his grandfather's cows avoided, and which slopes seemed to hold moisture after rain while the rest of the land dried out in a day. He was not physically imposing. At 14, he was lean and angular, all elbows and sharp angles, with calloused hands that looked older than the rest of him. He'd spent summers on his grandfather Earl's property since he was old enough to walk the fence line, and somewhere along the way, he'd developed a relationship with the land that went beyond anything he'd been taught. Nobody quite knew what to make of him. His teachers thought he was smart but distracted. His classmates thought he was strange. His parents worried he spent too much time alone. Only Earl seemed to understand, or at least seemed unbothered by it. The old man would sometimes sit beside Marcus on the porch steps in the evening, watching the light go flat across the field and not say a word. That was enough. What Marcus had noticed, what had been building in for 2 long summers before he ever touched a shovel, nobody around him had thought to ask about. What exactly had he seen that everyone else had missed? Gravel Creek was not a large town, but it was a proud one. The farming culture there ran deep, 3, 4, sometimes 5 generations deep on the same parcels of land. People knew their soil. They knew their seasons. They knew when to plant and when to pull back, when to irrigate and when to let nature carry the load. They had survived droughts before. They had weathered floods and late frosts and commodity crashes. They were not people who panicked easily, and they were not people who entertained new ideas without a very good reason. So when word got around that Earl Hale's teenage grandson was digging up half an acre of perfectly good farmland to build some kind of pond, the community's response was swift and unanimous. It was ridiculous. For starters, that corner of Earl's property was flat and fertile, exactly the kind of ground you didn't mess with. Farmers understood the arithmetic of land. Every acre that couldn't be planted was money that wouldn't grow. A pond served fishermen, not farmers, and Marcus wasn't much of a fisherman. The project was costing money Earl didn't have in abundance, time Marcus should have been spending on school, and goodwill the family could ill afford to waste in a community that already thought the Hales were a little eccentric. The criticism was relentless. Not malicious exactly. These were neighbors after all, but blunt in the way rural communities can be when they think someone is making a mistake. You heard it at the hardware store. You heard it after church. You heard it over the CB radio on slow afternoons. Someone ought to talk some sense into that boy. Earl's getting old. He don't know what the kid's up to. I'll tell you what that pond's good for. Mosquitoes, and yet Marcus kept digging. Every morning, every afternoon after school. Weekends without exception. He didn't argue back. He didn't explain himself. He just worked, day after relentless day, while the hole grew deeper and the criticism grew louder. Why was he so certain he was right? If you've ever been told you were too young, too inexperienced, or too deaf to know what you're doing, take a moment to like this video. Subscribe for more true-style stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. And tell us, where are you watching from today? The answer began with a box of old notebooks that smelled like tobacco and river water. Marcus had found them in the back of Earl's barn the previous winter, stacked under a tarp beside a broken seed drill and 2 rusted fence stretchers. They belonged to Earl's father, Leland Hale, who had farmed the same property from the early 1930s through the mid-1960s. Leland had kept meticulous records, rainfall, creek levels, soil conditions, well depth readings, the kind of obsessive agricultural diary that only a certain type of man would bother to maintain. Marcus read every page. What he found in those notebooks was not dramatic at first. It was subtle. A pattern in the numbers that only became visible when you looked at. Decades of data laid out side by side, creek levels dropping gradually, wealth depths increasing over time, rainfall totals staying roughly stable, but the land's ability to hold and move that water shifting in ways that didn't fully make sense. Then Marcus found something else. Tucked between two notebooks was a folded geological survey map from the county extension office, dated 1951. Someone, Leland, presumably had marked it by hand. Small X's along the ridge above the valley, notes in the margins, natural recharge area, water moves slow here, interception point. Marcus took the map to the county library and spent 3 Saturday afternoons cross-referencing it with soil surveys, historical water table records, and 2 dense academic papers on groundwater hydrology that he barely understood but worked through line by line, looking words up in a dictionary when he had to. He didn't have the full picture yet, but he had enough. Enough to believe that something was happening beneath the valley, something slow, quiet, and serious that nobody else had thought to look for. While Marcus dug, the valley whispered. It was the kind of whispering that was easy to dismiss if you weren't paying attention, and almost nobody was. The Dennison family, whose property backed up against the ridge on the east side of Gravel Creek, mentioned at a town meeting that their well pump had been cycling longer than usual. They weren't worried, old pipes probably, worth getting checked. The small spring that ran along the north fence line of the Purdy farm, a spring that had produced reliable water within living memory, had thinned to barely a seep by late June. Gene Purdy chalked it up to the dry spring they'd had. It'll pick back up, he said. The creek that ran through the center of the valley, a permanent fixture called Barton Run, dropped lower than locals could remember seeing it in July. Not alarming, just low. People photographed it with their phones and posted it online. A few people commented that it looked strange, then they moved on. The oldest farmers noticed something else. The soil was behaving oddly. Ground that normally held moisture for 5 or 6 days after a good rain was drying out in 2 or 3. You'd walk a field and the top 2 inches would be bone dry while there was still some moisture below, but less than usual, and it was dropping faster. These were quiet signals. Individually, each one had an explanation. Together, they were telling a story, but you had to know what you were listening for. Marcus knew. He worked faster. That autumn was dry. Not catastrophically dry, not the kind of drought that makes the national news and triggers federal aid declarations, just quietly, stubbornly dry. The kind of dry that wears you down slowly, the way a slow leak flattens a tire. You don't notice until you're already riding on the rim. The National Weather Service reported that the region had received about 70% of its historical average rainfall over the past 18 months. Meteorologists shrugged. Variability was normal. Statistical noise, not a pattern worth getting excited about. The county agricultural extension agent made a visit to the area and advised farmers to monitor their water usage. Standard precaution. Nothing to be alarmed about. Meanwhile, Marcus was expanding the pond. He'd finished the initial excavation that summer, but now he was deepening one end and shaping the banks to create what he'd read about as a slow water zone, a section where rainwater would be captured, held, and given time to percolate slowly into the earth rather than running off. He'd also started installing a series of shallow berms along the uphill edge of the pond, small earthwork ridges designed to slow and direct water flow toward the depression rather than past it. Along the pond's perimeter, he seeded native grasses and deep-rooted plants, species he'd researched specifically for their ability to hold banks stable and filter surface runoff before it reached the water. To anyone watching, it looked like a teenage boy making an already strange project even stranger. The ridicule picked up. It had a new edge to it now, not just amusement, but a kind of impatience. People were dealing with drier conditions, tighter water budgets, and creeping anxiety, and here was this kid making things weirder on purpose. That Hale boy is out there moving dirt again. At this point, I think it's a personality disorder. Marcus said nothing. He stacked another berm. He shaped another bank. He kept working. By the following spring, something had shifted in Gravel Creek, and not for the better. Barton Run didn't fully recover over the winter the way it should have. After a normal wet season, the creek would swell and tumble and fill its banks, replenishing itself from months of snowmelt and slow rain. That year it came back halfway. It moved, but it was thin and cautious, like something that had lost confidence in itself. The soil in the lower fields cracked earlier than anyone could remember. Not just surface cracking, deep, jagged fissures that split the ground and swallowed fingers when you stuck them in. Farmers who had irrigated from shallow wells their whole lives found themselves drilling deeper, spending money they hadn't budgeted. The county put a voluntary water restriction in place. Conserve where possible. It was advisory, not mandatory, not yet. Old-timers started pulling out memory like currency, comparing notes, trading stories of dry years past, trying to locate this moment on a mental map of the cycles they'd lived through. Most of them concluded it was temporary, rough patch. Every decade had one. The pond on Earl Hale's property sat there, a strange and quiet presence at the edge of the valley, still taking shape in ways that made no sense to anyone watching, incomprehensible to almost everyone. Marcus visited it every morning before school. He checked the water level, noted where the banks were holding, where they needed reinforcing. He carried a small notebook now, his own version of what his great-grandfather had kept, and logged everything he saw. He still said very little, but the look on his face had changed. He wasn't worried exactly. He was waiting. The wells started failing in June. The first was the Callaway place, on the western edge of the valley. Their pump started pulling air on a Thursday morning. Dave Callaway called the well service company that afternoon. The technician came out, dropped a camera down the shaft, and came back up looking puzzled. The water table had dropped below the pump intake. Not by inches, by feet. By the following week, 3 more families reported the same problem. Then 5, then by the end of the month, it was a dozen. The scale of it hit the community the way a slow realization always hits harder than a sudden one, because you've been telling yourself it's not happening until the moment you can't pretend anymore. Families that had drawn water from the same wells for 30 and for years were suddenly hauling it in from town, 50-gallon containers loaded into truck beds, driven back out to properties that had never needed that kind of effort before. The feed store started carrying extra stock of water storage tanks. They sold out in 4 days. Livestock were affected. Cows that had always had reliable access to water began losing condition. Horses grew restless. Chickens, which need water constantly to produce eggs, began laying less. Small operations that ran on thin margins absorbed the cost as long as they could, then started making difficult decisions. Gardens wilted. Crops in the lower fields, the ones farthest from the hills and most dependent on groundwater, went into stress first. Corn leaves curled. Beans yellowed prematurely. The people who farmed them walked their rows in the morning heat with a feeling that sat somewhere between helplessness and fury. Gravel Creek was scared, and somewhere in the middle of all that fear, people started looking at the pond. What Marcus had understood, and what the valley had forgotten, was how groundwater actually works. Most people think of water underground the way they think of water in a bucket. If you pour rain on the ground, it fills up. If you pump it out, it empties. The reality is far more complicated. Groundwater is not static. It moves slowly and continuously through porous layers of rock and sediment, replenished from specific points on the surface called recharge zones, places where water can sink deep into the earth rather than running off. The valley around Gravel Creek had been quietly losing its primary recharge capacity for decades. Development along the ridge had paved and compacted land that once allowed rainfall to percolate slowly into the aquifer below. Farming practices in the lower fields, heavy tillage, soil compaction from equipment, reduced vegetative cover in certain seasons had further reduced the land's ability to absorb and hold water. What little rain fell increasingly ran off into Barton Run and out of the watershed entirely, instead of sinking down to replenish the wells. Leland Hale's old notebooks had recorded this happening in slow motion across 40 years. The geological survey map had identified exactly where the best remaining recharge points were, and Marcus had cross-referenced both with modern hydrology research until a clear picture emerged. If someone built a pond at the right location, in the right geological position, shaped in the right way, with the right earthworks to slow and direct surface water toward the recharge zone, that pond could act as a passive groundwater replenishment system, not a fix overnight, not magic, but a steady, quiet restoration of what the land had once done naturally. The corner of Earl's property where Marcus had chosen to dig was sitting directly above what Leland's survey had marked as an interception point, a place where the geology made downward water movement particularly efficient. Every inch of rain that fell into that pond and soaked slowly into the earth was moving toward the aquifer that fed the valley's wells. Marcus had not been destroying farmland. He had been saving it. The results were not instant. They rarely are with groundwater. But they were measurable, and in the context of a community watching their water disappear, measurable meant everything. The Hale property well never failed. Through the worst of the dry period, while neighbors were hauling water and calling drilling companies, Earl's well held steady, not overflowing but producing, reliably day after day. More significantly, 3 neighboring properties, the ones whose parcels shared the same underlying geology as the Hale land, reported that their wells, while stressed, had not dropped to the critical levels seen elsewhere in the valley. The effect was not dramatic, but it was there. The cattle on Earl's property, which had always had access to the pond's edge as a supplemental water source, came through the dry season in noticeably better condition than livestock on surrounding farms. The vegetative buffer Marcus had planted around the pond's perimeter, native grasses and deep-rooted plants that held the banks stable and filtered. Runoff had created a small zone of relative greenness in the middle of a landscape going brown. A county soil and water conservation technician who came out to assess the drought impact did a double take when she walked the Hale property. She spent 2 hours there. She asked Marcus questions. He answered them carefully, walking her through the notebook data, the geology map, the research papers he'd annotated in pencil. She left looking like she was doing arithmetic in her head. She came back a week later with a colleague. It didn't happen all at once. There was no moment where the community gathered, bowed its head, and formally apologized to a 14-year-old boy. That's not how small towns work. What happened instead was quieter, and in its way more meaningful. Ray Cutter, the man who'd leaned on the fence post and declared Marcus had lost his mind, showed up on a Wednesday afternoon without calling ahead. He stood at the edge of the pond for a long time, hands in his pockets watching the water. Then he asked Marcus how the berms were constructed. He asked what kind of plants were growing along the bank. He asked how Marcus had figured out where to put the whole thing. He didn't apologize. He just asked questions, and he listened, really listened in a way he hadn't before. Gene Purdy came by 2 days later, then the Calloway family. Then a group of 4 farmers who drove out together on a Saturday morning like they were touring someone else's operation, which in a sense, they were. The laughter had stopped, not with a bang, but with a gradual, almost imperceptible fading. The jokes that had circulated at the feed store died out the way jokes always do when the thing they're mocking turns out to be right. People changed the subject instead. They talked about the drought, about the county water restrictions, about what might come next. But some of them, more and more of them, stopped on the way home and looked at that pond. By the following autumn, 4 families in the valley had broken ground on ponds of their own. Marcus helped plan 2 of them, not because anyone had formally asked him to, but because he showed up when he heard they were starting. And the people doing the digging found they had questions only he could answer. He walked the land with them the way he'd walked Earl's. He read the slope. He identified the best recharge position. He talked them through the berm construction in plain language, no condescension, no satisfaction at being right. The County Soil and Water Conservation Office published a brief case study, anonymizing the property, calling it simply a privately constructed passive recharge pond in a rural valley setting. The results Marcus had achieved were modest but real, and the methodology was sound enough that the technician who'd visited recommended it as a model for other water-stressed agricultural communities in the region. A teacher at the regional high school brought the case into her environmental science class. She didn't mention Marcus by name at first. She presented the data and asked students to discuss the reasoning behind the pond design. A girl in the back of the room figured it out halfway through the discussion and said so. The class talked about it for the rest of the period. Word reached the State Agricultural University. A graduate student in hydrology contacted Earl Hale to ask if she could include the pond in a research project on small-scale groundwater management. Earl said yes and told her to talk to Marcus. The boy who'd been laughed at for over a year was now being cited. Marcus Hale never gave a speech about it. He never held a press conference, never posted a triumphant video, never stood in front of the community and said, "I told you so." It would not have occurred to him to do any of those things. He was not built for vindication. He was built for noticing. The summer he turned 15, he spent most of his free time at the pond, not performing or explaining or being admired, just sitting with it. The way Earl had taught him to sit with the land, quietly watching, recording the small shifts in water level and bank condition, making notes in his notebook. Earl watched him from the porch sometimes, coffee going cold in his hand, and felt something he couldn't fully name. Pride, yes, but something older than pride. Something like recognition, the feeling of seeing someone find their place in the world and settle into it with certainty. There is a particular kind of wisdom that doesn't come from a classroom or a certification or a credential. It comes from attention, from the long, unglamorous practice of looking at something carefully over and over until it tells you what it needs you to know. Marcus had that wisdom at 14. He had developed it in silence and solitude, in the space between what the adults around him assumed and what the land was actually saying. The community hadn't been wrong to question him. Skepticism is healthy. What they'd been wrong about was deciding before listening, before asking, before understanding that a 14-year-old couldn't possibly know something they didn't. Sometimes the loudest voices in a community aren't the ones paying the closest attention, and sometimes the person everyone dismisses is the one quietly preparing for a future nobody else can see. The pond they laughed at became the reason they still had water when the wells finally ran dry.